Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to have you, and if you're returning, I'm excited to see you again. Welcome back. On my channel, we talk about true crime mostly. Once I get a little less busy, I do plan to add an element of strange history. I have done a couple of those in the past, or conspiracy theory, or just anything weird. So if that's something you might be interested in, you can go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the bell icon so you can be notified when I upload. Only if you want to, no pressure. I do want to give a quick warning that some of the things that we talk about here can be kind of heavy. So if that's something your mental health can't handle, just do me a favor and click off this video. I will catch you somewhere else, but your mental health will always be so much more important than any YouTube video ever will be. With that, I did want to add one more little element, is that I want everyone to remember that these are real people that we're talking about and real stories. So I know in today's case, especially, there are still people who are alive and still affected by the case that we're going to be talking about. So please remember to remain respectful and kind whenever having a conversation about this, because you just never know who might be watching. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and jump into today's video. Today's video is a wild one. I am very interested to see what you all think about it, because I myself kind of go back and forth a little bit. So I'm really curious to see what y'all think about this case in particular. Today we're going to be talking about the sleepwalking murder case. So this is the case of Scott and Yarmila Falater. Scott was born on September 14th of 1955 in Miami Beach, Florida. He and his family would then move to Chicago, Illinois, and that's where he spent the majority of his childhood. Scott grew up very Catholic, and he was more of a kind of quiet and reserved person, or that's how he was described as a child. When Scott was in high school, he met Yarmila. Yarmila was actually kind of enchanted by him because he would always fall asleep in their same English class, and she kind of thought this was a little quirky thing that he would do, but she was actually really interested in him, and Scott would eventually ask Yarmila out on a date. And funnily enough, Yarmila and Scott would never date again after this. Yarmila was Scott's first date of any kind, first romantic relationship or romantic interest of any kind, and that was just it for them. They stayed together for the rest of Yarmila's life. Scott would call Yarmila Yarm for short, and they seemed very, very happy together. Yarmila was also Catholic. She had been born and raised Catholic, and so this was an interest that they had together. Scott would eventually propose to Yarmila, and she happily accepted. She was very ready to start a life with him. Sometime before their wedding, Scott was actually approached by a couple of missionaries from the Church of the Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, and he would actually make the switch from Catholicism over to Mormonism. And he converted, and eventually Yarmila would follow him in this too. She made the switch from Catholicism to Mormonism. And I don't know if this has anything to do with the fact that Scott had, or if this was something Yarmila actually wanted to do, but I do think in Mormonism it is just really looked down upon to marry someone who is not a part of Mormonism. So if Yarmila made the switch simply to be able to marry Scott is something that I don't know and could not find out in my research, but Yarmila did switch over to Mormonism as well. Scott and Yarmila would get married while they were in college, and Scott was 20 years old. Scott was actually going to school for engineering, and he was going to become a successful engineer in his lifetime. Shortly after they got married in June of 1981, Scott and Yarmila welcomed their first child into their life. Their first child was a daughter who they named Megan, and then 3 short years later they would have another child, this time a boy named Michael. Yarmila would give up her career so she would be able to stay at home and be with her children, and this was something it seemed that she did happily because she loved being a mother. She was a wonderful mother who was dedicated to her children's upbringing, and so this was something that it seemed like she did happily. And Scott was working as an engineer, so he was making plenty of money to support the family just by working himself. Eventually, Scott would get a job offer for Motorola. Now, I don't know if you guys remember, but in the late 80s to the early 2000s, Motorola was a tech giant. They had like the flip phones. They're still a thing today, but they're just not as prominent as Samsung or Apple would be. But Scott was able to secure a job with Motorola working as an engineer. This job was actually in Phoenix, Arizona. So Scott and Yarmila packed up everything and moved their family from Chicago to Phoenix, Arizona to start this new chapter in their life. Scott and Yarmila fit in happily with the community. They were able to find a Mormon church. It seems like Mormonism is a little bit more prominent in the western area of the United States, and so they were able to find a church and they settled in nicely there. They found a good home in a quiet community that was relatively crime-free. Things just seemed to fall into place for the couple and their family. And everyone who met Scott and Yarmila really felt like they were the perfect couple. There was never any fighting. They were able to communicate effectively. It just seemed like they worked really, really well together as a couple. In fact, there was a lot of times when Yarmila would go out with her girlfriends and everyone would just be kind of nitpicking about their husbands, and then they would ask Yarmila if there was something that she could complain about when it came to Scott. And her answer was always, no, things are pretty good between us for the most, usually. And everyone just thought this was kind of strange, because even if you do have an excellent relationship with your significant other, there always seems to be just something that you can nitpick about them. But Yarmila really didn't seem to have that. She seemed to really appreciate and love Scott. And Scott was the same way with Yarmila. They just seemed to have this beautiful relationship and they were going to be together forever. All of this would come to an end in a very strange twist on January 16th of 1997. January 16th started off very normal for the family. Scott would always get up early and go teach like a morning service at his church. This was something that he did daily. So at 6 a.m. he was at the church, he was giving this morning service, and then he would come home, pick up his daughter and take her to school, and then go to work like normal. When Scott came home, the family had dinner together and Yarmila kind of cleaned up and they got the kids to bed around 9 p.m. Yarmila then asked Scott if he would go fix their pool. According to Scott, Yarmila was deathly afraid of the pool going green. So even though Scott had to write his sermon for the next day for church and get ready for work and all those things, Scott went out and tried to fix the pool. Apparently the O-ring was leaking and they wanted to make sure that nothing was going to be severely damaged. And so he went out and tried to fix the pool. He was unsuccessful in fixing the pool, and so he came back inside and told Yarmila that he had not been able to get it done, but that he would try again tomorrow. Scott then says that he went to bed anywhere between 10 and 10:30. Scott said that he had woken Yarmila up, that she had fallen asleep on the couch while she was watching TV, so he had to wake her up to tell her that he was not able to fix the pool, but he would do it another night, and then he went to bed by himself upstairs. Somewhere between 10 and 11 p.m., Scott and Yarmila's neighbor, Greg Coons, and his girlfriend Stephanie said that they heard strange noises coming from the Falaters' household. They were like moaning sounds or groaning sounds. They couldn't quite understand what was going on, but they were very strange sounds coming from the Falater home. Greg decided to peek over the fence that was separating their house, and that's when he saw Yarmila laying on the patio ground. She looked like she was passed out. Greg thought that maybe Yarmila had had too much to drink, and then he saw Scott come and kind of lean over her. So he figured that Scott was just trying to wake her up to bring her back into the house. But then he saw Scott grab Yarmila by the arms, drag her into the pool, throw her into the pool, and then hold her head underwater. Greg quickly called 911 and had them dispatched to the Falater home. When police arrived at the Falater home, they did find Yarmila in the pool. At first, the pool had like a pinkish tint to it, but when they tried to remove Yarmila from the pool itself, the pinkish tint turned much more red, and the officers said that they had never seen a shark attack in person, but that they assumed that this is what it would look like if it had been a shark attack. There was so much blood. In later medical examiner reports, it would be found that Yarmila had been stabbed over 40 times. After the investigators pulled Yarmila out of the pool, they made entrance into the home. The back door was slightly ajar, so they made entrance into the home to see if everyone there was okay. And that's where they found Scott on the top of the stairs. He seemed dazed, he seemed confused, he seemed like he didn't know what was going on. In fact, he asked the officers what was going on. The officers then asked Scott who all was in the home, and Scott responded with himself, his wife, and their 2 children. Scott was then handcuffed and put into the back of a police cruiser. It was after this that police made entrance into the house again, and this time they woke up the 2 children. Both Megan and Michael had slept through the entire event, but the investigators told them that their parents had gotten into an argument and that they had been called to help resolve the issue, but they were not immediately told that Jarmila had died. Eventually they did have to tell the children though. Megan and Michael both seemed very alarmed by this because they had never seen their parents fight, let alone fight to the point where police would have to be called in order to help resolve it. This was all extremely shocking because for all they knew, their parents lived in peace together. Scott was taken in for an interrogation, and during the interrogation, he seemed genuinely surprised that they thought that he had murdered Jarmila. He said he did not remember doing any of that. He said that he had no clue that he had murdered Jarmila, but it is important to note that he did not deny that he had murdered Jarmila. The only thing he would tell investigators is that he loved Jarmila very much and that he would never intentionally hurt her. So this interrogation didn't last very long because police just couldn't get anything out of Scott. But still, with the eyewitness testimony, they had enough to arrest and charge Scott with Jarmila's murder. During the booking process, they did look over Scott's body a little bit. He was wearing a fresh set of pajamas with no blood on them, but they were able to find blood spatter behind his ear, and this was consistent with someone who had stabbed someone else. This would have been like the consistency that the blood would have splattered onto Scott had he been the one to stab Jarmila. They were also able to see that Scott had a fresh cut on his hand that had recently been bandaged, so Scott had put a brand new bandage on it before being arrested. Scott's defense started immediately. Scott was adamant that he did not remember harming Jarmila, and he was even more adamant that he would never hurt her intentionally. At first, his defense team thought maybe they would go with something like an insanity plea or something along those lines, but finally Scott's family came forward and told them about several sleepwalking incidents that Scott had had during his childhood up into his adult life in college. His sister recalls one in particular where it was right before Scott and Jarmila were getting married and Scott was going through finals in college. One night he was sleepwalking and his sister had unintentionally kind of disturbed him during the sleepwalking process, and Scott had reacted violently. He had pushed her across the room, and his sister says that the look he had on his face was so evil she could only describe it as demonic. But she knew that Scott was sleepwalking during this and that he hadn't done it intentionally, and so they really thought that maybe Scott was sleepwalking during the time that he had murdered Jarmila, because it just seems so far-fetched that he would have done this on purpose. Now, while it does sound crazy, his defense did decide to go with the sleepwalking defense, and it is crazy, but it has been done successfully before. There was a man in Ontario, Canada that was actually acquitted of murder after having proven that he was sleepwalking during the murder of his mother-in-law and the attack on his father-in-law. Several years prior to this, Kenneth Park got into a car, drove 14 miles, murdered his mother-in-law, attacked his father-in-law. His father-in-law did survive, and he claimed that he was sleepwalking during this entire process. He was acquitted. They did find that he was in fact sleepwalking while he committed this crime, and he was set free. So while it does sound like Scott's defense team is absolutely crazy in using this defense, they really weren't, because it's been done successfully before. In order to help prove this defense, Scott was put under a 4-night sleep study. During this sleep study, they put electrodes on his head, or like, you know, those little patches to monitor brain activity while he was sleeping. And they were able to find something called hypersynchronous delta waves. So according to this sleep expert, or most sleep experts, the majority of us, when we're sleeping, we can transition from one sleep cycle to the next smoothly with no disruption. But for people who sleepwalk, there's disruption in those cycles, and that's what makes them get up and start walking around. And they could tell with these with this brain activity that they were seeing, that Michael was in fact a sleepwalker. This sleep expert also believed that sleepwalking becomes much more prominent when someone is under good amounts of stress, and Scott was actually currently under a lot of stress. At work, Scott had a team and they were currently working on a microchip project for Motorola. Apparently, this project was getting ready to be cut, and that meant that Scott and his entire team would be out of a job. So this stress was weighing heavy on Scott's mind. On top of the pool, him not being able to fix the pool, apparently this was also really heavy on his mind. The night that Jarmila was attacked, Scott did go to sleep with the pool on his mind. He had not been able to fix the pool like he wanted to, so the sleep expert really kind of thought that during his sleep, he got up to finish fixing the pool. He took the knife out there with him to cut the O-rings so he could make it fit better. So that's when Jarmila got up to go see what Scott was doing, and she disrupted his sleepwalk because he was actually out there sleepwalking trying to fix the pool. And when Jarmila woke him up, that's when he attacked her, because according to this sleep expert, people who are sleepwalking have no facial recognition, so he would have not been able to see that it was actually Jarmila he was attacking, and that this was just somebody who was preventing him from doing the task that he was on. So the sleep expert that worked with the defense team was fully convinced that Scott was in fact sleepwalking during this whole ordeal. But the prosecution had a different idea. They had evidence that the marriage between Scott and Jarmila was not as picture perfect as they wanted everyone to think it was. Jarmila was really starting to get bothered by the amount of time that Scott was at the church. He was always at the church working on something, and this really seemed to bother Jarmila, who wanted to kind of maybe move a little bit away from the church and didn't want to spend as much time there. They were also able to find out that there might have been an affair going on. Either Scott was having an affair or Jarmila was having an affair. I'm not sure who. So it's not a leap to think that Scott found out about an affair that Jarmila was having, or Jarmila found out about an affair that he was having, and Scott could have attacked her out of rage, pure rage. The prosecution was also able to find a sleep expert of their own. This sleep expert did not buy the sleepwalking defense. The reason he thought that it wasn't sleepwalking was that when Scott went back out to the pool to continue working on the pool, he had gotten redressed in some jeans, and he had also taken a flashlight with him. According to this sleep expert, someone who is sleepwalking cannot differentiate between light and dark. So the reason that Scott took the flashlight outside with him shows this sleep expert that Scott was well aware that it was dark outside, and he would need to be able to see. Putting on the jeans also meant that Scott knew that it was chilly outside and that he would be cold without them. According to the sleep expert, the prosecution sleep expert, sleepwalking people are not able to differentiate between hot and cold. So if it's hot outside, they won't be able to, think, oh, I need to get some shorts on. Or if it's cold outside, they won't think I need to get a coat on. So the fact that Scott knew it was both dark and cold outside meant that he probably wasn't sleepwalking to this sleep expert. Scott's neighbor Greg also testified that he witnessed Scott go back upstairs and change his clothes. The investigators were later able to find that Scott had taken the clothes that he was wearing when he murdered Jarmila and put them in a plastic container along with the knife that he had used during the crime. Scott then took this plastic container and hid it in the wheel well of his car. He then also went upstairs and bandaged the cut he had received on his hand. The prosecution's sleep expert says that if he was in fact sleepwalking, he would not have been aware that he had blood on his clothes, and he wouldn't have known to get rid of the murder weapon and try to hide it or bandage himself up. Another strange thing is that Scott claims that he had not heard Jarmila screaming for help, but Greg, his neighbor, saw him trying to calm down their dog that was barking like crazy. This dog was going crazy, and the neighbor saw Greg try to calm down his dog. But the defense team's sleep expert said that she had been told that the dog was jumping up onto Greg, and that's why he was trying to calm down the dog, because the dog had physically touched him, so he knew that he needed to calm down the dog. The defense team also questioned Greg's testimony. When he was first talking to investigators, he said that it looked like Scott had kind of stumbled over Jarmila's body and then pushed her into the pool. But during later testimony, he told them that Scott had gone directly to Jarmila's body and pushed her into the pool. So it's not quite adding up, because in one case, if he was sleepwalking, maybe he was just walking around when he stumbled over Yarmala's body, and then during a sleepwalking state tried to just pull something that he thought was just some random thing out of his way. But if he wasn't sleepwalking, he would have gone directly to Yarmala, maybe after realizing that she wasn't dead, and pushing her into the pool. But the prosecution argued that Scott had intended on leaving Yarmala out on the patio. That way her children would find her the next morning and Scott could act like the alarmed husband. But when he was kind of cleaning himself up, he realized that Yarmala was in fact still not dead after stabbing her over 40 times, and so that's when he pushed her into the pool. Prosecutions say that Scott had no idea that there was an eyewitness to the murder, and when police arrived much sooner than he thought they would, that's when he started feigning like he had no idea what was going on. It is also believed that Scott knew about the case of the sleepwalker in Canada and thought that maybe he could use this as his defense successfully the way Kenneth had. But eventually the jury was unable to buy the sleepwalking defense, and they did find Scott Falater guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The jury said that there were too many stab wounds and that Scott had taken too many steps in the commission of this crime that they were unable to buy that he was sleepwalking the entire time. There was some talk that maybe he had begun the attack while he was asleep and then woke up during it and tried to cover up his crime instead of just admitting to what had happened. So maybe if he hadn't have taken so many steps, it would have been more believable, but I'm just honestly not too sure what to believe when it comes to this case. I will say that it seems like Michael and Scott have kind of maintained a relationship while he's been in prison, while the one between Scott and Megan has become pretty strained during his time in prison. But like I said, I'm really curious to know what you all think about this case. This one is an absolutely wild one, and I'm just not entirely sure what I think about it. There were times during my research where I was like, okay, I could probably believe it, right? But then I would see some other contradicting evidence and I would be like, okay, there's no way he was asleep this entire time. There is a small part of me that maybe believes at first he was sleepwalking, but then he thought, I have to finish it now because I've already started. But then you take in the whole, was someone having an affair? So did he just explode one day? But it seems like such a crazy change going from a couple that gets along really well and communicates so effectively to this. But I would love to know your thoughts. So if you want to, you can leave them down in the comments. If you don't want to, that's cool too. But just please remember to remain respectful. Here's another little reminder that if you like this kind of thing, you can hit the subscribe button as well as the bell icon. Then you can be notified when I upload. But that's pretty much all I have for you today. So, yeah, I will try to get a post up again next week. No promises though. I'm kind of shooting for every other week at this point, just until I can get my schedule fixed. I've got a couple things coming up that I'm pretty excited about. So if you guys want to hang out for or stick around for that, that would be great. I will announce them in a month or two. So yeah, but that's really all I have for you guys today. I hope this finds you so well. I'm sending you all so much love, and I will see you soon. Bye.